In the vast expanse of Scandinavia, where a harsh climate forged an unyielding spirit, no single monarch or centralized authority could subjugate the will of the populace. Each independent Scandinavian community, whether a small village or a larger settlement, maintained its autonomy, proclaiming its own chief or king, rendering them unpredictable and astonishingly resilient. To execute their bold and daring designs, these seafarers united into powerful flotillas, leaving their women and children behind to embark on perilous sea voyages. Their primary objective was plunder, and thus they armed themselves with extreme thoroughness and practicality. Among the first to experience the full wrath of these nascent sea wolves were the defenseless monks of Lindisfarne, a holy sanctuary located in the British Isles. In June 793 CE, the monastery of St. Cuthbert at Lindisfarne was rightly considered one of the most sacred sites in all of Britain, a repository not only of deep piety, but also of untold, tangible treasures. Imagine the scene. Peaceful monks, their day measured by the tolling of bells, heading to Mass, when suddenly, silhouettes resembling dragons emerged from the sea mist. They descended upon the abbey like a sudden, destructive storm, bringing death and devastation, mercilessly destroying everything in their path and setting sacred structures ablaze. For the surviving monks, it was a veritable hell on earth, and they later often described what happened as if devils themselves had burst forth from the abyss to fall upon them. Undoubtedly, the Vikings were warriors to their very core. Their entire lives were built on intimidation, instilling fear and pure terror. They acted as ruthless raiders, not as traditional soldiers of regular armies. Their ferocity, avarice, and incredible skill were undeniable. Although contemporaries often branded these people as barbarians, their battle formations and disciplined, almost mechanical movement towards their objectives attested to astonishing military organization. The Viking warrior was an extremely efficient and simple fighting machine. He was typically a large, muscular Scandinavian, often clad in tough leather armor. Each was armed with incredibly simple yet deadly tools: a knife, a sword, and, of course, a battle axe. The battle axe, by numerous accounts, was the most formidable weapon in their arsenal, as Vikings possessed phenomenal skill in throwing these axes, capable of decapitating an opponent or incapacitating them with a single throw. Coastal monasteries were particularly appealing targets for the Vikings, thanks to their vast accumulations of wealth and, alas, the passivity and defenselessness of the monks themselves. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which began to be kept in the late 800s and is one of the primary sources of English history from the 5th to the 11th century, vividly and horrifyingly describes the terror caused by these Viking invasions. It states, "The ravaging of the heathens miserably destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through rapine and slaughter." This attack on the monks and their invaluable treasures, occurring in 793 CE, was truly a historical landmark, the first documented major Viking raid. However, Lindisfarne and other vulnerable monasteries scattered along the coasts of the British Isles were merely a prelude to the coming upheavals. By the end of the 8th century, the ambitions of Viking raiders had significantly grown, and they began to target much larger prizes. The powerful cities of Europe were on the verge of experiencing the full force and furious rage of these Northmen and, no less importantly, the incomparable power of their astonishing ships. The Vikings departed their northern lands of Scandinavia, driven by one overarching purpose: plunder. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793 CE seemed to ignite a sinister fire of Viking barbarism that threatened to engulf the entire European continent with alarming speed. By the mid-9th century, just half a century after the tragedy of Lindisfarne, rumors of Europe's immense wealth spread far north, reaching the most remote fjords. Inspired by tales of easy prey, entire families, villages, and vast communities united, embarking on the feverish construction of their famous longships. They harbored plans to improve their lot by enriching themselves at the expense of those who lived across the sea. Just as Spanish conquistadors centuries later arrived in the Americas craving gold, so too did the Vikings seek silver. It was silver that held the greatest value for them. Many religious artifacts, precious crosses, and various ritual items, which were abundantly stored in monasteries, were made precisely from this noble metal. Individual Viking factions dispersed across the boundless seas, lacking a single ruler to unite them. Even when their flotillas swelled to dozens of formidable ships, each operated independently, which paradoxically made these attacks even more difficult to repel and halt. The reputations of individual Viking chiefs began to grow rapidly, and with it, their ambitions. Europe, it seemed, was entirely ready for the taking, lying before them like a ripe fruit. Europe is a unique continent due to its extensive river network, where almost all rivers are navigable, unlike North America or Africa, where there are only a few major navigable rivers. In Europe, however, there are many, which allowed the Vikings to launch their vessels into virtually any large body of water. It's important to remember that their ships were narrow and long, requiring very little water to move forward. One of the first and most significant river attacks occurred in 845 CE, led by the renowned Viking chieftain Ragnar. With a fleet of 120 ships, he applied the tactics tested at Lindisfarne with double force to attack Paris. Even before they reached the city walls, Ragnar's warriors mercilessly annihilated a French advance guard on the banks of the Seine, dooming their French captives to a horrifying fate. They were, in essence, masterful terrorists, relying heavily on terror to smooth their way. They did not seek to do more work than was absolutely necessary, so their actions were as horrifying and intimidating as possible. There was even one notorious Viking cynically dubbed the child lover because he would not toss infants into the air to impale them on his sword as they fell. These were, without exaggeration, extremely unpleasant individuals. The local monk Ermentarius painfully described the Viking onslaught and the destruction that continued for decades along the Seine and other rivers. The number of ships steadily increased, and the endless stream of Vikings never ceased to instill dread. Everywhere, Christians fell victim to mass murder, arson, and plunder. The Vikings conquered everything in their path, and it seemed nothing could stand against them. When a massive Viking fleet sailed down the Seine River and began its advance towards Paris, a huge, well-defended city, the King of France, Charles the Bald, instead of offering resistance and facing the enemy head-on, chose to pay off the Vikings. He paid Ragnar nearly 6 tons of silver and gold ingots to persuade the raiders to leave and never return. However, this decision had the exact opposite effect. Rumors of such unheard-of bounty spread across the northern lands with lightning speed. The plundering of northern Europe continued with new, even greater intensity, foreshadowing decades of fresh suffering and destruction for the entire continent. What awaited Europe next, as the appetite of these northern warriors only intensified? Between 790 and 1100 CE, the Vikings relentlessly followed every major river and waterway, penetrating deep into continental interiors. However, a whole new world opened up for these intrepid seafarers. It was the Norwegians, arguably, who penned the most vivid and dynamic chapter in the extensive chronicle of Viking history. As fearless explorers, they set about colonizing Iceland and Greenland, steadily pushing further west. Intertwined with this expansion is the story of 2 legendary Norwegian Vikings, Eric the Red and his son, Leif Erikson. In the late 990s, Eric became the first to venture into settling these harsh lands. Being a man of fiery and impulsive temperament, Eric soon vanished from Iceland for 3 whole years. He sailed west by sea and established a settlement on the eastern coast of Greenland. It was here that he began actively marketing this new land, unable to directly state, "By the way, we only have a small habitable stretch of coast here." Instead, he would say something like, "We have Greenland. It's covered in green. Come and see what it's really like, and then go home." And yet, many strong, resilient, and enduring Vikings remained, despite their lives being exceedingly harsh. The land was not very suitable for farming, yet fishing was available, and other meat was also plentiful, but overall, it was an extremely inhospitable territory. During Eric the Red's rule, the North Norwegian agrarian society struggled to survive in this remote world. For governance and general matters, villages gathered at the Althing, a type of public assembly or court, a tradition carried over from their homeland. Here, free men had the inalienable right to speak in their own defense and discuss matters concerning the entire community. It was from this community of free men that Eric the Red Sun, Leif Erikson, emerged. Like his father, he burned with an insatiable desire to explore new horizons. In 1000 CE, he set sail. Leif Erikson was following a rumor. Another Viking before him had left a record that he had traveled west, intending to reach another colony in Greenland, but was blown off course, and by the time he found his way back, he found himself off the coast of a very green and lush land. Well, Greenland was neither green nor lush. This is a fascinating but still very controversial historical hypothesis. Many researchers are inclined to believe that America was discovered by Vikings around 1000 CE. Leif Erikson's village in Newfoundland, for example, has been carbon dated precisely to 1000 CE. Thus, it is definitively known that Vikings were at least in Newfoundland and likely ventured further south. The Greenlanders' attempt to settle a colony in Newfoundland lasted only a decade, but 500 years before Columbus made his epic journey, the Vikings had already connected the eastern and western hemispheres. After wintering in Newfoundland, Leif Erikson returned to Greenland and brought something entirely new to the island's settlers. Using the same tools with which they built their famous longships, they now erected crude crosses of a new religion. They made a collective decision to embrace Christianity. Leif Erikson had previously traveled to Norway, where the king had specifically asked him to bring Christianity to Greenland and Christianize the colonies, which he diligently carried out. As Viking influence spread, the outside world, in turn, began to shape and change Viking culture. Chiefs viewed Christianity as a powerful means to unite disparate clans and, ultimately, to gain greater control over them. At the dawn of the 11th century, 200 years after the attack on Lindisfarne, the northern peoples still lacked a single king and possessed a very weak sense of solidarity. It was Christianity that presented a compelling reason for unification. However, Christian Vikings faced fierce resistance from their pagan kinsmen, who adamantly refused to abandon their ancient gods. Kings began to adopt Christianity because it helped them. It aided in consolidating their power, and they began to actively impose it on these people. Much struggle ensued. People disliked it. They didn't want to abandon their old customs. They were afraid to abandon their old customs. There were Christian missionaries who arrived on the island and converted some, but many skeptics remained. And one day, they decided to conduct a trial, a confrontation between pagan deities and a representative of pagan deities, who was known as a berserker, a man whose psyche was, to put it mildly, somewhat unstable. And so these Christian newcomers issued a challenge, stating, "We will light a fire, and you pagans will light a fire. If the berserker can walk through your fire but cannot walk through ours, then we will know that Christianity has won. If he cannot walk through yours, then we will know that paganism has won." It almost resembled an Old Testament duel. The source claims that the Viking berserker easily walked through the fire lit by the pagans, but could not walk through the fire lit by the Christians. And thus, all present saw that Christianity was the true religion, and as a result, they adopted it. Back in Norway, the great catalyst for Viking unity manifested in the fate of a young boy. Harald Hardrada, the half-brother of the Norwegian King Olaf, was his heir. He was only 15 when he fought on the losing side in a Viking civil war. But Harald returned to seek revenge and wrote his history in the blood of his enemies. Vikings continued to spread across Europe like a deadly plague. First, the invaders unleashed their might upon defenseless monasteries, but soon their terror spread across the entire continent, deepening into its heartland. Ultimately, internal strife divided the Vikings themselves, and Norway plunged into civil war by 1030. The Battle of Stiklestad became the arena for a clash between forces loyal to the then Danish ruler Knut the Great and the troops of the Norwegian King Olaf. From the ashes of these internecine conflicts rose a young warrior named Harald Hardrada, King Olaf's half-brother and rightful heir. By the mid-11th century, having reached maturity, Harald harbored ambitious plans to unite and lead Norway. However, to do so, he first had to seize the necessary power. Harald was a remarkable figure. His regime, as a Viking, if one could call it that, began in his youth. At 16, he was wounded in a battle that ultimately claimed his royal brother's life and was forced to flee. Harald Hardrada found himself in exile in distant northern lands. His path led first to Sweden, and then, eventually, to Kiev, a flourishing trade center in modern-day Ukraine. In 1031, he followed the route of the Swedish Vikings, who, for the previous 2 centuries, had actively established trading posts to access exotic Eastern goods. The Swedes initially came as brutal raiders, but over time remained to become traders. Through trade, Kiev served as a link between the northern world and the vast East. When archaeologists discover coin hoards from that period, they find coins from all over the world, as well as items resembling miniature Buddha statues and ruins of Hindu deities. This attested to the deep connections of these peoples, which became even more significant due to the blending of various cultures. Harold understood that without a market for his plunder, his power would be limited. Vikings had lived by trade for hundreds of years. When they raided a monastery, seizing many chalices and manuscripts, they weren't going to carry them home. What good would that do? They needed a place where they could exchange these valuables for what they truly desired. However, material goods were only part of their trade. Vikings also actively traded people. As slave traders, they exchanged men and women captured during their raids. Women in those times died at a horrifying rate in childbirth, which required a constant replenishment of the female population. They seized young girls, took them away, undoubtedly raped them, and then delivered them to slave pens and sold them. Despite these harsh economic lessons, Harold arrived not only to seek his fortune in the market. He also had to embrace the mantle of a warrior and acquire the skills that would make him king. By 1038, Harold had become self-assured and eager for plunder. Leading an elite unit of Viking warriors, he fought on behalf of foreign rulers throughout the East, accumulating wealth and power, preparing for his return to Norway and the seizure of the crown. In Sicily, Harold demonstrated his legendary ingenuity. Harold's generalship is characterized not so much by great courage as by outstanding cunning, and this is the Vikings' main virtue. Instead of merely applying brute force, they preferred to act covertly. One of his tactics involved approaching a besieged city and ordering his men to catch small birds flying into and out of the city. With tar and rope, they tied small burning twigs to the birds' backs and released them. The birds flew back into the city to their nests and into the thatched roofs, immediately setting the city on fire. Thus they took the city. In Harold's saga, the 13th century Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson recounted the effectiveness of the plan to conquer the city. He writes that all the inhabitants came out of the city, pleading for mercy. The very people who had for days shouted defiant insults at the army and its leader. Harold spared the lives of all who asked for mercy and took control of the city. After nearly 15 years, the cunning Harold had amassed the reputation and wealth necessary to finally stake his legitimate claim to his fragmented homeland. In 1046, he returned to Scandinavia, a famous mercenary with the wealth and ambition of a king, but without the title. As next in line for the Norwegian throne, he was ready to assert his rights. The problem was that his nephew occupied the throne. To reclaim it, he had to negotiate a bit. He proved to be quite politically astute and, of course, struck a deal with his nephew whereby they could co-rule. This worked. The nephew died a year later. There is no evidence to suggest Harold killed him, although, of course, such accusations were hurled. And ultimately, Harold once again took charge of Norway. After Harold asserted his claim to the throne, he set about ensuring that his power remained unchallenged. In 1047, he began eliminating his opponents, using a brutal combination of tactics and vengeance. Harold unleashed unholy fury on all who opposed him. In 1047 CE, after years of consolidating power, Harald Hardrada became king of Norway. He ruled the Vikings by sheer force. Harald's men were ruthless, devastating the farms and villages of those who opposed him. Their message was simple: submit or die. Throughout the country, Harold's enemies paid the ultimate price for their disloyalty. In Harold's saga, the king glorified his insatiable cruelty with his own words: "I kill without remorse and remember all my killings." Treachery must be rooted out by any means, fair or foul, before it consumes me. Oaks of rebellion grow from acorns of betrayal. After the rebellion was mercilessly suppressed, it was time for triumphant jubilation. King Harold's loyal followers gathered in his spacious longhouse, where a lavish and magnificent celebration awaited them. In the Viking world, an abundance of gold and wealth was an undeniable indicator of high status and power, as it was the generous distribution of these treasures among the people that allowed a chieftain to gather and maintain his warring armies. Warriors not only needed to be fed but also showered with coveted gold, which served as a powerful incentive. The ability to bestow a gold ring for an outstanding feat or present a precious cup for valor was an inherent part of leadership. Thus, possessing vast stores of treasure was key to gaining significance and influence, which fully aligned with Harold's strategy, who accumulated immense wealth through so-called palace plunderings. A true Viking lord attracted people not only through strength and charismatic personality, but also through an impeccable reputation as a victor, capable of leading his warriors to great triumphs and protecting them from demise. This is why they gathered in these magnificent halls, where grand feasts were held, where everyone received their share of gold, drank copious amounts of heady mead, and at times, between banquets, took up a sword and embarked on another bloody massacre. However, for the most part, this hall life was a central element of Viking existence. In the Great Hall, important political deals were struck, strong alliances were forged, and supreme power was wielded. This system was remarkably flexible, allowing Vikings to adapt to any situation, maneuver quickly, and reorganize. It could change instantly if a leader fell, died in battle, was humiliated, or any other event occurred, and then someone else would immediately rise, often coming from a completely different side. Inspired by prosperous Kiev, King Harold made the strategic decision to establish a major trading center in a coastal city, where goods from all corners of the known world would converge. This settlement, named Oslo, was destined to become one of the region's greatest ports. King Harold deeply believed that trade would be the force to unite the Viking people and bring them long-awaited wealth and stability. Oslo's markets teemed with diverse goods, both from Viking lands, wheat, vegetables, furs, and textiles, and brought by Viking longships from across the known world. Spices, gold, fine textiles, precious stones, and exquisite pottery. Here one could acquire glass from Germany, elaborate silver jewelry from France, and even coins from distant Arab lands. The Viking people gradually transformed into skilled and shrewd traders. As Oslo grew and prospered, the daily life of this thriving trading community was revealed in objects buried alongside gold. Intricately engraved weapons, precious jewelry, and even simple wooden idols, reflecting the beliefs of the Vikings themselves. However, the success in developing a major trading center only whetted Harold's insatiable appetite for even greater wealth and complete control. Harold decided it was time for a larger objective, and that objective was England. He immediately set sail on campaign, joined, of course, by the rebellious brother of the English king, and so Harold Hardrada embarked on his fateful journey. Looking ahead to England, Harold undoubtedly envisioned his empire stretching as far as his invincible longships could reach. Once merely a refugee, he had now gained astonishing power and colossal political influence among his warlike people. He had already subdued the most powerful of his Viking enemies, and his actions met with only minor resistance. England, with all its untold riches, seemed like easily accessible prey, about to fall into his iron grip. But Harold and his men were not in for an easy ride. A strong and disciplined army awaited them, and a struggle that promised to be greater than any he had ever faced. In late September 1066 CE, a rider arrived in the city of York, bearing grim and urgent news. The Viking king Harold Hardrada was approaching. The English were well aware of his reputation for merciless cruelty, and it was clear that only swift action and great courage could halt his onslaught. Harold began his conquest from the coast, and after a rapid succession of fierce conflicts, his victory seemed almost certain. York appeared ready to surrender. Harold and a portion of his troops headed towards Stamford Bridge, located about 7 miles from the city. He expected the leaders of York to bring tribute and present hostages as a sign of submission. In fact, Harold was so convinced that northern England already belonged to him that his army was not at full strength, and they had even left their armor behind. However, the English were not so complacent. Their king, Harold Godwin's son, led his soldiers on a forced march through the forest to cut off the Viking army. His swordsmen were clad in chain mail, and his archers were well armed. According to the sagas, when the English army appeared, the Vikings were utterly astonished to see their armor gleaming in the midday sun as they approached. Initially, they couldn't identify them, but as the force drew closer, recognition dawned. The saga of King Harold describes this sight as a sheet of ice to the Vikings due to the glinting of their weapons. It was at this critical juncture that Harold made a fateful decision. Instead of retreating and awaiting the arrival of the remaining troops from the ships,